The crystal chandeliers cast dancing shadows across the ballroom as Isabella Sterling stood in her ivory silk wedding gown, watching her new husband drink champagne with barely concealed disgust. Alexander Hunt, the most powerful businessman in Manhattan, looked at her as if she were a stain on his expensive suit. Their marriage, only 4 hours old, already felt like a prison sentence. Isabella had known this day would come ever since Richard Hunt, Alexander's silver-haired grandfather, had approached her 6 months ago. The old man's proposition had been simple yet impossible to refuse. Marry his grandson, help protect the family empire from those who sought to destroy it from within, and in return, receive the resources she desperately needed to honor her mother's dying wish. The wedding had been a spectacle worthy of royalty. 500 guests, imported roses from Ecuador, a 7-tier cake that cost more than most people earned in a year. But beneath the glittering surface, Isabella felt the weight of Alexander's hatred pressing down on her shoulders like a physical force. She had tried to speak with him before the ceremony, to explain the truth behind their arrangement, but he had refused to listen. In his mind, she was nothing more than a gold digger who had manipulated his vulnerable grandfather. The contempt in his steel-gray eyes told her everything she needed to know about what awaited her. "Smile, darling," Alexander whispered harshly as he placed his hand on her waist for another photograph. His touch was cold, mechanical. "We wouldn't want our guests to think this marriage is anything less than perfect." Isabella forced her lips into a curve that resembled a smile. She had learned long ago how to wear masks, how to hide her true feelings beneath layers of practiced calm. Growing up in foster care after her mother's death had taught her that showing weakness only invited more pain. As midnight approached, Alexander's patience finally ran out. He gripped her elbow with unnecessary force and announced to nearby guests that they were retiring for the evening. The knowing smiles and winks from the crowd made Isabella's stomach turn. They thought this was a love match, a fairy tale come true. If only they knew the truth. The presidential suite at the Plaza Hotel was obscenely luxurious. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked Central Park, now dark except for scattered streetlights. Rose petals covered every surface, and champagne chilled in a silver bucket. It was designed for romance, for passion, for new beginnings. Instead, it would witness the death of any pretense between them. The moment the door closed, Alexander transformed. The polite mask he wore for society vanished, replaced by raw fury. He loosened his bow tie with jerky movements, his jaw clenched so tight Isabella could see the muscles jumping beneath his tanned skin. "Well, congratulations," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You've managed to trap yourself a billionaire. I hope you're proud of yourself." Isabella remained silent, setting her bouquet down on a nearby table with deliberate care. She had prepared herself for this moment, but the venom in his voice still stung more than she wanted to admit. "Don't stand there acting innocent," Alexander continued, pacing like a caged animal. "I know exactly what you are. An opportunist who saw a lonely old man and decided to cash in. My grandfather's illness has made him vulnerable, and you exploited that. Your grandfather is sharper than you give him credit for," Isabella finally spoke, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. "Don't defend your manipulation," Alexander snapped. He moved closer, using his considerable height to intimidate her. "Let me make something perfectly clear. This marriage is a legal arrangement, nothing more. You'll live in my house, wear expensive clothes, and play the role of Mrs. Hunt in public. But in private, you are nothing to me. Less than nothing." Isabella met his gaze without flinching. She had faced worse than an angry billionaire. The years in foster care, the struggle to put herself through college while working 3 jobs, the night she held her mother's hand as cancer took her away. Those experiences had forged her into someone who couldn't be broken by cruel words. "You'll have your own wing of the house," Alexander continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "We'll maintain separate lives. And as for tonight, as for what's supposed to happen on a wedding night." He glanced toward the rose-petal-covered bed with obvious disdain. The thought of touching you makes me sick. You'll sleep alone, as you should. He expected tears. He expected begging or anger or some kind of emotional breakdown that would confirm his belief that she was weak, desperate, unworthy. What he didn't expect was for Isabella to smile. It wasn't a happy smile or a sad one. It was something else entirely, something that made Alexander pause mid-rant. There was knowledge in that smile, secrets hidden in the curve of her lips. Isabella took a step toward him, closing the distance he had created. She could smell his cologne, expensive and masculine, mixed with the subtle scent of champagne and anger. For a moment, they stood so close that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "You really don't know anything, do you?" she said softly, almost gently. "You think you have everything figured out, but you're completely blind to what's happening in your own house." Alexander's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about? Your grandfather didn't arrange this marriage because he's senile or because I manipulated him," Isabella continued, her voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. "He did it because I'm the only person who can save your family's empire from the people who are already destroying it from the inside." "That's ridiculous," Alexander scoffed, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his expression. Isabella reached up, her hand hovering near his face but not quite touching. She could see his body tense, unsure whether to pull away or wait for what came next. Then she leaned in, her lips nearly brushing his ear as she whispered the words that would haunt him for weeks to come. "Don't worry about your bed, Alexander," she said, her breath warm against his skin. "You're not the one I think about at night." She let that first dagger sink in, watching his face change from confusion to shock. Before he could respond, she delivered the second blow. "And about your precious family empire, you should ask your sister Charlotte why she's been meeting with Marcus Blackwood every Tuesday at the Four Seasons. Or ask your CFO why $3 million disappeared from the overseas accounts last quarter." She paused, letting the information settle. "Your grandfather knew you were too blinded by your own arrogance to see the truth. That's why he brought me in." Isabella stepped back, watching Alexander's face cycle through emotions, disbelief, anger, confusion, and something else. Something that looked almost like fear. "How do you know about Blackwood?" Alexander demanded, his voice rough. Marcus Blackwood was his biggest corporate rival, the one man who had been trying to acquire Hunt Industries for years. "I know a lot of things," Isabella replied calmly. She walked to her luggage and pulled out a simple nightgown, completely ignoring the romantic lingerie that his grandmother had undoubtedly packed. "I know that your sister resents you for inheriting control of the company. I know that your CFO, James Morrison, has a gambling problem and debts he can't pay. I know that someone in your inner circle is selling company secrets." "You're lying," Alexander said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Ask your grandfather tomorrow," Isabella suggested, heading toward one of the suite spare bedrooms. "He'll tell you why he really arranged this marriage. It wasn't about merging properties or family legacy. It was about survival." She paused at the doorway, looking back at him one final time. The powerful, confident billionaire now looked shaken, his carefully constructed worldview crumbling. "Oh, and Alexander," she added, that mysterious smile returning. "About that man I think about at night. He's someone who actually sees me as a person, not a balance sheet. Someone who values strength instead of fearing it. Someone completely unlike you." With that, she entered the bedroom and quietly closed the door, leaving Alexander standing alone in the romantic suite, surrounded by rose petals and the ruins of his certainty. For the first time in his adult life, Alexander Hunt felt completely out of control. The woman he had dismissed as a gold digger had just revealed herself as something far more complex and dangerous. She had information that could destroy people he trusted, knowledge of conspiracies he knew nothing about, and most infuriating of all, she seemed completely unaffected by his wealth, his power, or his rejection. He poured himself a glass of whiskey from the bar, his hand slightly unsteady. The image of her calm, knowing smile burned in his mind. Who was Isabella Sterling really? And who was this other man she claimed to desire? That last revelation bothered him more than he wanted to admit. The idea that she preferred someone else, that she found him lacking, ignited something dark and possessive in his chest. It was irrational, hypocritical even, considering he had just told her he found her repulsive. But rationality had fled the moment she whispered those words in his ear. Alexander walked to the window, staring out at the glittering city below. Tomorrow, he would investigate everything she had said. He would tear apart every claim, every accusation, until he found the truth. And if she was lying, if this was some elaborate game, he would make her regret ever crossing him. But if she was telling the truth, if there really was a conspiracy within his own company, within his own family, then everything he thought he knew was wrong. And Isabella Sterling, the woman he had married and dismissed, might be the only ally he had. He turned back to look at the closed bedroom door. Behind it lay a mystery wrapped in silk and secrets, a woman who had just turned his entire world upside down with a few whispered words. The wedding night was over, but Alexander Hunt knew with absolute certainty that his real battle with Isabella Sterling had only just begun. The morning sun painted Manhattan in shades of gold and amber as Alexander's black Mercedes pulled through the iron gates of the Hunt estate. Isabella sat in the passenger seat, her hands folded calmly in her lap, watching the massive colonial mansion grow larger as they approached. She had researched this place extensively, memorized its layout, studied its history. But seeing it in person was different. The white columns rising 3 stories high, the manicured garden stretching for acres, the fountain in the circular driveway depicting Greek gods. This wasn't just a home. It was a statement of power. Alexander hadn't spoken a single word during the hour-long drive from the hotel. He had spent the night making phone calls, and Isabella knew without asking that he had been investigating her claims. The tension radiating from him told her he had found at least some confirmation of what she had revealed. His knuckles were white against the steering wheel, his jaw set in a hard line. The car stopped at the main entrance where a line of household staff waited to greet them. Isabella recognized faces from the research files Sophia Montgomery had provided her. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, a stern woman in her 60s. The butler, James, who had served the Hunt family for 30 years. Several maids and groundskeepers, all wearing polite but curious expressions. "Welcome home, Mr. Hunt," Mrs. Patterson said as they emerged from the car. Her eyes flickered to Isabella with barely concealed judgment. "And welcome, Mrs. Hunt." The title sounded strange to Isabella's ears. Mrs. Hunt. It connected her to a legacy she had no right to, a family that didn't want her, a man who despised her existence. "Thank you," Isabella replied graciously, her voice warm despite the cold reception. "I look forward to getting to know everyone." Before anyone could respond, the mansion's front door burst open and a woman in designer yoga wear came striding out. Charlotte Hunt was 28, 2 years younger than Alexander, with the same dark hair and sharp features. But where Alexander's eyes were steel gray, Charlotte's were ice blue and currently burning with barely restrained fury. "So this is her," Charlotte announced, looking Isabella up and down like she was examining a questionable piece of merchandise. The mystery woman who somehow convinced grandfather to force this ridiculous marriage. "I have to say, I expected someone more impressive." "Charlotte," Alexander warned, his voice low. "What? I'm just being honest." Charlotte circled Isabella slowly, her heels clicking on the cobblestone driveway. "Tell me, Isabella, is it true you grew up in foster care? How absolutely tragic. And now here you are, married to one of the wealthiest men in America. What a convenient upgrade." Isabella met Charlotte's hostile gaze without flinching. She had dealt with mean girls in high school, cruel foster siblings, and professors who dismissed her because of her background. Charlotte Hunt was just another bully in expensive clothes. "Yes, I grew up in foster care after my mother died," Isabella said calmly. "It taught me to value things that money can't buy. Like loyalty, for instance. And the ability to recognize when someone is trying to destroy what they claim to love. Charlotte's eyes narrowed dangerously. What is that supposed to mean? It means that Tuesday afternoons at the Four Seasons must be exhausting, Isabella replied sweetly. All those secret meetings require such dedication. The color drained from Charlotte's face, confirming what Isabella already knew. Alexander's sister had indeed been meeting with Marcus Blackwood, though the full extent of their relationship was still unclear. I don't know what lies you've been telling Alexander, Charlotte hissed, stepping closer, but I will not be intimidated in my own home by some opportunistic nobody. This is Alexander's home, Isabella corrected gently. You just live here. There's a difference. Before Charlotte could respond, an older man appeared in the doorway. Richard Hunt, despite his 78 years and failing health, still carried himself with authority. His silver hair was perfectly groomed, his suit immaculate. When he saw Isabella, his stern expression softened into something almost affectionate. Isabella, my dear, he said, descending the steps with careful dignity. Welcome to the family. I trust my grandson has been treating you well. The irony in his question wasn't lost on anyone present. Alexander's jaw tightened visibly, but he remained silent. Thank you, Mr. Hunt, Isabella said, genuinely warm as she took the old man's offered hand. Your grandson has been exactly what I expected. Richard chuckled, a sound that held both amusement and sadness. I'm sure he has. Come inside, all of you. We have much to discuss. The interior of the mansion was even more impressive than the exterior. Marble floors, crystal chandeliers, priceless artwork covering walls that stretched up to vaulted ceilings. It was beautiful, cold, and felt more like a museum than a home. Isabella could feel the weight of generations of Hunt family history pressing down from every corner. They gathered in Richard's study, a wood-paneled room lined with leather-bound books and smelling of cigar smoke and old money. Alexander stood by the fireplace, his arms crossed, looking like he wanted to interrogate everyone present. Charlotte perched on the edge of a chair, her expression murderous. Richard settled behind his massive desk with a weary sigh. I suppose you've started investigating, Richard said, looking at Alexander. Have you found anything interesting? I found that my CFO has been embezzling money for 6 months, Alexander said coldly. I found that Charlotte has been meeting with Marcus Blackwood, though she claims they're just friends. I found that someone has been leaking confidential information about our merger negotiations. What I haven't found is an explanation for why my wife knew all of this before I did. Because I asked her to investigate, Richard replied calmly. 6 months ago, when I first suspected something was wrong, I hired Isabella to look into matters discreetly. She was recommended by an old friend as someone uniquely qualified for such delicate work. Alexander stared at his grandfather in disbelief. You hired her? To spy on our family? To protect our family, Richard corrected. Isabella isn't just some random woman I found to marry you, Alexander. She has a master's degree in forensic accounting from Columbia. She spent 3 years working for the FBI's white-collar crime division before going private. She specializes in corporate espionage and internal investigations. Isabella watched Alexander's face as this information sank in. She saw the moment his entire perception of her shifted, cracked, reformed into something new and equally uncomfortable. You're a corporate investigator, he said slowly. Among other things, Isabella confirmed. Your grandfather hired me to find out who was trying to destroy Hunt Industries from the inside. The marriage was his idea to give me complete access and legal protection. I agreed because the fee he offered would fund the children's literacy foundation my mother dreamed of creating before she died. Charlotte stood abruptly. This is insane. Grandfather, you can't seriously expect us to believe that you arranged Alexander's marriage to some hired detective. I arranged Alexander's marriage to the one person capable of saving this company, Richard said firmly. And if you're innocent of wrongdoing, Charlotte, you have nothing to fear from her presence. But if you're not? He let the threat hang in the air. Charlotte's face flushed red. I am not conspiring against this family. Marcus Blackwood and I are friends, nothing more. We went to Harvard together. We occasionally have lunch. That doesn't make me a traitor. Then explain the offshore account, Isabella said quietly. The one that received a $200,000 deposit the day after you met with Blackwood last month. The room went silent. Charlotte's face cycled through shock, panic, and finally settled on defiance. You have no proof of that. I have bank records, email correspondence, and photographs, Isabella replied, her voice never losing its calm tone. I also have evidence that you've been sharing confidential information about upcoming acquisitions, allowing Blackwood to position his company advantageously. The question isn't whether you did it. The question is why. Charlotte's composure finally shattered. Because I deserve to run this company, she shouted, tears of frustration streaming down her face. I went to Harvard Business School. I graduated top of my class. I've worked for Hunt Industries for 6 years, but grandfather gave everything to Alexander just because he's a man. It's not fair. So you decided to sell out your family? Alexander's voice was quiet but deadly. You partnered with our biggest competitor because you felt slighted? I partnered with someone who actually values me, Charlotte shot back. Marcus offered me a position as co-CEO of the merged company after the takeover. He sees my worth even if you and grandfather never did. Richard closed his eyes, looking every one of his 78 years. Charlotte, I gave Alexander the company because he had the vision and ruthlessness necessary to run it, not because of his gender. You're brilliant, but you're also impulsive and emotional. This situation proves my point. I gave you everything, Alexander said, his voice rough with emotion Isabella hadn't heard before. You're my sister. I trusted you. And you've been plotting to destroy me? For a moment, Charlotte's mask cracked entirely, and Isabella saw genuine pain beneath the anger. You don't understand what it's like, Charlotte whispered. Always being second. Always being overlooked. I didn't want to hurt you, Alexander. I just wanted what should have been mine. By betraying everything our family built? Alexander shook his head in disgust. Get out. Pack your things and leave this house by tonight. Alexander, Richard began, but his grandson cut him off. No, grandfather. She made her choice. Let her live with the consequences. Charlotte looked between them, seeming to realize the magnitude of what she had done. Where am I supposed to go? To your friend Marcus, I suppose, Alexander said coldly. Though I doubt he'll want you once he realizes his plan has failed. Isabella has documented everything. We'll be filing criminal charges by the end of the week. Charlotte's face went white. She looked at Isabella with pure hatred. This is all your fault. You came into this family and destroyed everything. No, Isabella said softly. You destroyed it yourself. I just exposed the truth. Charlotte fled the study, her sobs echoing through the mansion. The 3 remaining occupants sat in heavy silence, processing the devastation of the last hour. There are others involved, Isabella finally said. Charlotte didn't have the technical expertise to cover her tracks as well as she did. Someone in your IT department helped her. And James Morrison, your CFO, his gambling debts made him vulnerable to blackmail. Blackwood has been using him too. How many people in my company have betrayed me? Alexander asked, his voice hollow. At least 4 that I've confirmed so far, Isabella replied. But the conspiracy runs deeper. Marcus Blackwood has been planning this takeover for 2 years. He's been systematically identifying and exploiting weaknesses in your organization. Charlotte was just his biggest prize. Alexander moved to the window, staring out at the grounds he had grown up on. And you knew all of this before you married me? Yes. You let me believe you were a gold digger. You let me humiliate you. Your opinion of me was irrelevant to the job, Isabella said, though there was a slight edge to her voice now. I needed access to this house, to your files, to your family dynamics. The marriage gave me that. What you thought of me personally didn't matter. Didn't it? Alexander turned to face her, and Isabella saw something new in his eyes. Not anger or contempt, but a desperate need to understand. That man you mentioned. The one you think about. Does he exist? Isabella held his gaze. That's none of your business. Everything about you is my business now, Alexander said, moving closer. You're in my home, you're investigating my company, you're dismantling my family. I think I deserve to know who you really are. You deserve nothing, Isabella replied, standing to face him. You married me as a business transaction. You made it very clear that I mean nothing to you. Well, Alexander, the feeling is mutual. I'm here to do a job. Once it's complete, we can dissolve this marriage and go our separate ways. And if I don't want that? The words seemed to surprise Alexander as much as they surprised Isabella. What you want stopped mattering the moment you told me touching me made you sick, Isabella said, her voice finally showing a crack of emotion. You don't get to change your mind just because I'm not who you thought I was. Richard watched this exchange with interest, a small smile playing at his lips despite the situation. I'll leave you two to work this out, he said, standing slowly. Isabella, your investigation has exceeded my expectations. Continue as planned. Alexander, try not to be a complete fool. That woman is worth 10 of you, and if you're too stubborn to see it, you don't deserve her. After Richard left, Alexander and Isabella stood facing each other in the study, the distance between them feeling both vast and impossibly small. I was wrong about you, Alexander finally admitted. Yes, you were. I'm sorry for what I said last night. I was angry and I wanted to hurt you. You succeeded. Alexander flinched as if she had struck him. Isabella, I don't know how to fix this. You don't have to fix anything, Isabella said tiredly. Just let me do my job. Stay out of my way, and in a few months, this will all be over. She walked toward the door, but Alexander's voice stopped her. What if I don't want it to be over? Isabella turned back, studying his face. She saw confusion there, regret, and something else. Something that looked like the beginning of an obsession. Then you're going to be disappointed, she said softly. Because I learned a long time ago not to want things I can't have. And you, Alexander Hunt, are definitely something I can't have. She left him standing alone in the study, surrounded by the ruins of his family's betrayal and the growing realization that his convenient arranged marriage had become infinitely more complicated than he ever imagined. 3 weeks passed in the Hunt mansion like a carefully choreographed dance between two people determined not to touch. Isabella worked from a converted guest room that she had transformed into her investigation headquarters, spending 18-hour days compiling evidence, tracking financial transactions, and slowly unraveling the full extent of Marcus Blackwood's conspiracy. Alexander threw himself into damage control at Hunt Industries, systematically removing the traitors from his organization while trying to prevent the company's stock from crashing when news of the internal corruption inevitably leaked. They saw each other at breakfast, a silent affair where Alexander read the financial news while Isabella reviewed her case files. They passed each other in hallways, exchanging polite nods like strangers sharing a hotel. At night, Isabella could hear Alexander pacing in his study below her room, the sound of crystal against glass telling her he was drinking more than usual. She told herself she didn't care. That his obvious suffering wasn't her concern. But lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, she found herself thinking about him far more than was professional or wise. The man who had mocked her on their wedding night was gone, replaced by someone quieter, more thoughtful, and far more dangerous to her carefully constructed emotional walls. He watched her now with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness. Not with contempt, but with something that looked uncomfortably like fascination. On a Thursday evening, everything changed. Isabella was in the library, cross-referencing offshore transactions, when Alexander walked in carrying 2 glasses of wine. He had loosened his tie and rolled up his sleeves, looking exhausted but somehow more real than she had ever seen him. "You've been working for 16 hours straight," he said, offering her one of the glasses. "Take a break." Isabella considered refusing, but her neck ached and her eyes burned from staring at computer screens. She accepted the wine, careful not to let their fingers touch during the exchange. "I'm close to something," she explained, gesturing at her spread of documents. "Blackwood's money trail leads to a shell company in the Cayman Islands, but there's another player involved. Someone with even more resources than him." Alexander settled into the leather chair across from her desk. "Tell me." For the next hour, they worked together, Alexander's business acumen complementing Isabella's investigative skills. She showed him patterns he had missed, connections between seemingly unrelated transactions. He provided context about business relationships and industry dynamics that helped her understand motives. It was the first time they had functioned as actual partners, and Isabella was surprised by how naturally they worked together. "There," Alexander said suddenly, pointing at a series of transfers. "That routing number. I've seen it before in the files from our Tokyo office. Someone there authorized these transactions." Isabella pulled up her database and cross-referenced the information. Her breath caught as the pieces finally clicked into place. "It's not just someone in Tokyo. Alexander, this goes all the way to your board of directors. Victor Hensley has been working with Blackwood from the beginning." Victor Hensley was a 50-year-old board member who had been with Hunt Industries for 20 years, a trusted advisor to Richard Hunt himself. If he was involved, the betrayal cut even deeper than Charlotte's. Alexander's face went pale. "Victor was my father's best friend. He's been like an uncle to me my entire life." "Are you certain?" Isabella showed him the evidence, document after document proving Victor's involvement. She watched Alexander process the information, saw the moment his last bit of faith in the people around him shattered completely. "Everyone I trusted has betrayed me," he said quietly, staring at the papers. "Charlotte, Victor, half my executive team. The only person who's been honest with me is someone I treated like garbage from the moment we met." "I was hired to be honest," Isabella said, but her voice lacked its usual professional distance. "You don't owe me gratitude for doing my job." Alexander looked up at her, and the raw vulnerability in his expression made her heart constrict painfully. "Is that all this is to you? Just a job?" Isabella stood, moving to the window to put distance between them. The garden lights illuminated the grounds, peaceful and beautiful, hiding the ugliness festering inside these walls. What else would it be? She heard Alexander stand, heard his footsteps approaching until he was directly behind her. Close enough that she could feel his body heat, smell his cologne mixed with the faint scent of the wine they had been drinking. "I can't stop thinking about what you said on our wedding night," he admitted quietly. "About the man you think about. About how he's nothing like me. It's driving me insane, Isabella. I need to know who he is." "Why?" Isabella forced herself not to turn around, not to look at him. "So you can have him investigated? So you can prove I'm somehow using him against you too?" "No. Because the thought of you wanting someone else, anyone else, makes me feel things I have no right to feel." His voice dropped to barely a whisper. "Because somewhere between you destroying my family and saving my company, I've become obsessed with you. And I don't know how to make it stop." Isabella closed her eyes, fighting against the warmth spreading through her chest. This was exactly what she had been afraid of, what she had seen developing over the past weeks despite her best efforts to prevent it. "Alexander, don't do this." "Don't do what?" "Tell you the truth? You said you value honesty, so I'm being honest." He moved closer, his breath stirring her hair. "I was wrong about you, Isabella. Wrong about everything. You're not a gold digger or an opportunist. You're brilliant and strong and completely terrifying. You've taken apart my entire world and somehow made me grateful for it because at least now I know what's real and what's fake. I'm fake, Isabella said, finally turning to face him. The vulnerability in her own voice surprised her. This whole marriage is fake. What you're feeling isn't real, Alexander. It's just proximity and gratitude and the fact that I'm the first person who hasn't betrayed you. But it's not real. Then why are you trembling? Alexander asked softly, reaching up to touch her face. This time, Isabella didn't pull away. His fingers traced her jawline with devastating gentleness. Why does your breath catch every time I walk into a room? Why do you watch me when you think I'm not looking? Because I'm an idiot, Isabella whispered, feeling tears burn behind her eyes. Because despite knowing better, despite every lesson I learned about protecting myself, I started caring about you. And that man I mentioned on our wedding night? He doesn't exist, Alexander. I made him up to hurt you the way you hurt me. There's no one else. There's never been anyone else. The confession hung between them, raw and honest and more terrifying than anything Isabella had ever said. Alexander's eyes widened, processing her words, and then something shifted in his expression. Relief, desire, and something deeper that made Isabella's knees weak. Thank God, he breathed, and then his lips were on hers. The kiss was nothing like Isabella had imagined their first kiss would be during the lonely nights when she had allowed herself to think about it. It wasn't gentle or tentative. It was desperate, hungry, full of 3 weeks of tension and denial and fighting against something they both knew was inevitable. Alexander's hands tangled in her hair while hers gripped his shirt, pulling him closer, trying to eliminate any space between their bodies. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Alexander rested his forehead against hers. I'm sorry, he said roughly. For everything I said that first night. For how I treated you. For being too blind and stupid to see what was right in front of me. You were protecting yourself, Isabella said, though the memory of that night still stung. You thought I was a threat. You are a threat, Alexander replied with a slight smile. Just not the kind I thought. You're a threat to every wall I've built, every defense mechanism I've relied on. You make me want things I convinced myself I didn't need. Like trust. Like partnership. Like love. Isabella pulled back slightly, needing to see his face. Alexander, we barely know each other. What you're feeling is probably just relief that I'm not actually trying to destroy you. I know you grew up in foster care after your mother died of cancer when you were 12, Alexander said, his hands moving to frame her face. I know you put yourself through Columbia working 3 jobs and still graduated with honors. I know you joined the FBI because you wanted to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. I know you go to the children's hospital every Sunday to read to the kids in the cancer ward because it reminds you of your mother. I know you take your coffee black, you're allergic to strawberries, and you have a scar on your left shoulder from when you broke up a domestic violence call during your training. Isabella stared at him in shock. How do you know all of that? Because I've been investigating you the way you investigated my family, Alexander admitted without shame. Because I needed to understand who you really are. And what I found was someone extraordinary. Someone kind and brave and completely out of my league. Someone I definitely don't deserve but desperately want anyway. Before Isabella could respond, the study door burst open. Richard Hunt stood there, supported by his nurse, his face gray with pain but his eyes sharp with urgency. We have a problem, he gasped. Marcus Blackwood just called an emergency board meeting. He's making his move tonight. The moment of intimacy shattered as reality crashed back. Alexander's expression hardened into the ruthless businessman Isabella had first met. How is that possible? We removed his inside people. Not all of them, Isabella said, her mind already racing through possibilities. Victor Hensley is still on the board. If he's been gathering proxies from other shareholders. She pulled out her phone and started making calls, her voice crisp and professional. We need to know who's voting which way. Alexander, call your lawyer. We're going to need injunctions, restraining orders, everything we can throw at them. The next 6 hours were a blur of frantic activity. Isabella worked her contacts at the FBI and SEC while Alexander rallied his remaining loyal board members. Richard, despite his failing health, made calls to old friends and business associates, calling in decades of favors. They worked as a unit, finishing each other's sentences, anticipating each other's needs, fighting together against a common enemy. By 3 a.m, they had assembled in the Hunt Industries boardroom, a gleaming space on the 45th floor with views of the sleeping city. Marcus Blackwood sat at one end of the table, perfectly groomed despite the hour, his smile predatory. Victor Hensley sat beside him, unable to meet Alexander's eyes. Charlotte was there too, looking exhausted and defeated, clearly regretting her choices but too deep in to back out now. Gentlemen, lady, Blackwood began smoothly. Thank you for gathering on such short notice. I've called this meeting to present a vote of no confidence in Alexander Hunt's leadership. Given the recent scandals involving embezzlement and corporate espionage within Hunt Industries, I believe it's time for new management. I'm prepared to offer. You're prepared to offer nothing, Isabella interrupted, standing up. She had changed into a sharp black suit that made her look every inch the federal investigator she used to be. Because in approximately 3 minutes, FBI agents will arrive with warrants for your arrest, Mr. Blackwood. Also for Victor Hensley and Charlotte Hunt. Blackwood's smile faltered. I don't know what you think you have, but I have everything, Isabella said coldly, placing a thick folder on the table. 2 years of wire fraud, conspiracy to commit corporate espionage, bribery, money laundering, and racketeering. I have bank records, email correspondence, recorded phone calls, and testimony from James Morrison, who's already agreed to cooperate with federal prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. As if on cue, the boardroom doors opened and FBI agents filed in, led by a woman Isabella recognized from her time in the bureau. Marcus Blackwood, you're under arrest, the lead agent announced. As they read him his rights and placed him in handcuffs, Blackwood's composure finally cracked. He looked at Isabella with pure hatred. You're just a hired investigator, he spat. Who do you think you are? I'm the person who's smarter than you, Isabella replied calmly. And I'm also Mrs. Alexander Hunt. You tried to destroy my husband's family. That was your first mistake. Your second was underestimating me. As the FBI led Blackwood, Victor, and a sobbing Charlotte out of the boardroom, the remaining board members sat in stunned silence. Alexander moved to stand beside Isabella, his hand finding hers beneath the table and squeezing gently. I move that we vote to affirm our confidence in Alexander Hunt's leadership, one of the board members said. The vote was unanimous. When the room finally cleared and they were alone, Alexander pulled Isabella into his arms, holding her tightly as if afraid she might disappear. You did it, he said. You saved everything. We did it, Isabella corrected, wrapping her arms around his waist. Together. Alexander pulled back to look at her, his eyes intense with emotion. Isabella Sterling Hunt, I know this marriage started as a business arrangement. I know I gave you every reason to hate me. But I'm asking you, right now, to give me a chance to make it real. To let me spend the rest of my life proving that I'm worthy of you. To let me love you the way you deserve to be loved. Isabella felt tears spill down her cheeks, but for the first time in years, they were happy tears. You really are insane, she said with a watery laugh. We've been married less than a month and we barely know each other. Then we'll spend the next 50 years getting to know each other, Alexander said, wiping away her tears with his thumbs. Starting now. Tell me something about yourself that I don't know. Isabella smiled. I'm terrified of thunderstorms because my mother died during one. I hide in closets until they pass. Then I'll hide in closets with you, Alexander promised. What else? I always wanted a family, Isabella admitted quietly. A real one, not the temporary foster placements I grew up with. I wanted to belong somewhere, to someone. But I convinced myself it was impossible. That people like me don't get fairy tale endings. People like you get whatever the hell they want, Alexander said fiercely. And if you want a family, Isabella, I'll give you one. Brothers, sisters, children, a crazy grandfather who orchestrates marriages, a mansion full of people who will love you the way I do. You'll never be alone again. I promise you that. Isabella kissed him then, pouring all her hope and fear and desperate longing into it. When they finally broke apart, the first light of dawn was painting the sky pink and gold through the boardroom windows. A new day, a new beginning, a real marriage built on truth instead of lies. Take me home, Isabella whispered against his lips. Take me to our home. Alexander smiled, the first genuine smile she had ever seen from him, and it transformed his entire face. Anything you want, Mrs. Hunt. Anything you want. They left the boardroom hand in hand, walking past the empty trading floor where the day shift would soon arrive to learn that Hunt Industries had survived its greatest threat. They rode the elevator down in silence, stealing glances and small touches, unable to stop smiling like teenagers with their first crush. In the car on the way back to the mansion, Alexander's phone buzzed with a text from his grandfather. Isabella leaned over to read it and laughed. About time you pulled your head out of your ass and realized what you have. Don't screw this up, or I'll haunt you from beyond the grave. Also, I expect great-grandchildren within 2 years. Get to work. Love, grandfather. He's impossible, Alexander said, but there was warmth in his voice. He's wonderful, Isabella corrected. He knew exactly what he was doing when he brought us together. Remind me to thank him, Alexander said, bringing her hand to his lips. For giving me you. As they pulled through the gates of the Hunt estate, the sun was fully up now, illuminating the gardens in golden light. The mansion that had felt so cold and unwelcoming a month ago suddenly looked like home. Their home. Together. Isabella had spent her entire life searching for a place to belong, never believing she would find it. But as Alexander helped her out of the car and pulled her close for another kiss on the front steps of their mansion, she realized that home wasn't a place. It was a person. And she had finally found hers. The scorned millionaire husband had become something far more precious than Isabella ever imagined possible. He had become her partner, her protector, her love. And this time, when he carried her over the threshold, it wasn't a cruel mockery of tradition. It was a promise. A beginning. A forever. Their wedding night had ended in bitter words and separate rooms. But this morning, they would start their real marriage. One built on truth, trust, and a love neither of them had been looking for but both desperately needed. And as the door closed behind them, shutting out the world and all its complications, Isabella knew with absolute certainty that she had finally found what she had been searching for her entire life. She had found home. The end.